At 75 years old, after a lifetime of hating Islam, the Qur'an shattered all my certainties in just 3 days. Imagine a 75-year-old man who had spent 7 decades building his convictions, who believed he knew the truth about everything, suddenly sees his entire world collapse through the reading of a book he had always despised. That shouldn't be possible at this age. But it happened to me. My name is Heinrich Müller. I'm 75 years old and I was born in Munich, Germany in 1950. I grew up watching my country rebuild after the war, became an engineer, and spent my entire life believing that reason and logic were enough to explain everything. Leave a comment telling me which country you're watching this video from. I always read them. And if you want to hear more real stories of transformation like this one, subscribe to the channel. I was born in 1950 in a working-class neighborhood of Munich, the son of Hermann and Greta Müller. My father worked fixing engines in a small workshop, coming home every day with hands stained in grease. My mother sewed clothes for families in the neighborhood, wedding dresses, school uniforms, small repairs that helped with the household budget. We lived in a Germany under reconstruction. I remember the streets still scarred by bombings, the buildings going up brick by brick, hope mixed with the collective shame of what we had been as a nation. My parents rarely spoke about the war, but the scars were everywhere. In the tired faces of adults, in the untold stories, in the heavy silence that sometimes took over the dinner table. Religion was part of our routine, like shaving or brushing our teeth. Sundays meant mandatory Lutheran church, where I listened to sermons that deeply bored me. We prayed before meals with a memorized prayer without feeling. For my family, being Lutheran was a matter of German cultural identity, not genuine faith. God was a respectable family tradition, but a distant one. In school, I excelled in math and science. While other boys played soccer, I took apart clocks to understand how they worked. I studied mechanical engineering at the Technical University of Munich on a scholarship. My parents couldn't afford to pay for it. Later, driven by an insatiable intellectual curiosity about the meaning of existence, I studied philosophy at night. I built a respectable career at BMW, specializing in transmission systems. I married Ingrid, an elementary school teacher I met at a graduation party. We had Klaus and Petra, bought a house in Schwabing, and lived the emerging German middle-class dream. But alongside this seemingly successful life, I developed a rigidly materialistic worldview. To me, the universe was a complex machine governed by unchanging physical laws. Modern science had made God obsolete. We were merely evolved apes on an insignificant planet in a forgotten galaxy of an indifferent cosmos. Religion? Pure ignorance. A primitive remnant from when humans didn't understand lightning, earthquakes, or disease. Any intelligent, educated person should outgrow such childish fantasies. I prided myself on being a rational man, free from the superstitions that imprisoned less enlightened minds. My Islamophobia didn't come out of nowhere. It was built over decades by the news I watched religiously. Every night, for years, I saw the same images: terrorist attacks, Middle East conflicts, violent protests. To me, Islam was synonymous with backwardness, violence, and fanaticism. I remember talking at the retirees club, and all of us agreed. These people were a threat to our Western civilization. They didn't integrate, didn't respect our laws, and wanted to impose their medieval religion on us. I read articles about Sharia law, about women's rights, about terrorism, and everything confirmed what I already believed. To be honest, I didn't even try to meet real Muslims. I avoided any contact. When I saw a woman in a hijab or a bearded man at the supermarket, I judged them immediately. I thought, one more problem for our society. I was absolutely certain I knew the truth about Islam just from what I saw in the media and from history books that confirmed my biases. At 70, I retired, and for the first time in my life, I was alone with my thoughts. My wife had passed away 3 years earlier. My children lived far away and had their own lives. The house became too quiet. I started asking questions I had never asked before. What was the point of all those years of work? Why am I here? What happens when I die? Science and reason, my lifelong tools for understanding everything, could not answer these fundamental questions. During sleepless nights, I would stare at the ceiling, thinking about the emptiness I felt inside. I had built a perfect life according to society's standards, career, family, material possessions, but now, in old age, I felt I had lost something essential along the way. There was a hole in my soul that I didn't know how to fill. My rational mind couldn't explain this deep existential void, and for the first time in decades, I began to wonder if maybe I didn't know as much as I thought I did about life and its meaning. It was a rainy Tuesday in October when my life began to change. I was taking my morning walk in the Englischer Garten in Munich when I slipped in a puddle and fell on my back. The pain was intense. At 75, any fall can be dangerous. I was lying there on the wet ground trying to get up on my own when a gentle voice said in perfect German, "Sir, let me help you." It was a man in his mid-40s, well-groomed beard, wearing a small white cap and simple clothes. Exactly the kind of person I used to cross the street to avoid. But there, vulnerable and in pain, all I could see was a human being offering help. He helped me up with extreme care, checked to see if I was injured, and wiped the mud from my back with his own handkerchief. He insisted on walking me to a nearby bench and stayed with me until he was sure I was okay. During our conversation, I found out his name was Ahmad, a Syrian engineer who had been living in Germany for 15 years. What struck me most wasn't just his kindness, but the genuine concern in his eyes. He didn't try to convert me, didn't mention religion beyond a quiet, "May Allah protect you," at the end. He treated me as if I were his own father. When we said goodbye, I remained on the bench for another hour, completely confused. For decades, I had built a mental image of Muslims as dangerous, fanatical, incompatible with our society. But Ahmad showed more Christian compassion than many Christians I knew. For the first time in my life, a real, flesh-and-blood Muslim didn't fit any of the stereotypes I carried, and that deeply unsettled me. For an entire week, my encounter with Ahmad haunted me. I found myself wondering, if I was so wrong about him, what else might I be wrong about? My engineer's mind, always methodical, began to operate differently. I decided to do what I always did when I wanted to understand something, research it thoroughly. But this time, it wouldn't be to confirm my prejudices. It would be to finally discover the truth about Islam. If I was going to criticize something, I should at least know what I was talking about. One Saturday morning, I walked to the Hugendubel bookstore in downtown Munich. My plan was simple and, I admit, a bit arrogant. I was going to buy a German translation of the Qur'an, read it from cover to cover, and finally have solid, well-founded arguments to prove my position was right. I was convinced I would find obvious contradictions, scientific absurdities, messages of hatred and violence. After all, that had been my impression for decades based on what I'd seen and read in the media. I paid €18 for a translation by Max Henning, considered one of the most respected in German. On the way home, I felt like a detective about to expose a crime. I thought to myself, I'm finally going to discover the real Islam, not the distorted versions extremists present. I got home, made a strong coffee, sat down in my favorite armchair, and opened the book to the first page. I had no idea that in the next 72 hours, everything I believed about religion, life, purpose, and truth would be completely demolished. The first pages caught me completely off guard. I expected to find fanaticism, but instead, I read about compassion, mercy, social justice. I expected violence, but I found verses about protecting orphans, helping the poor, being kind to neighbors, even those of other religions. What shocked me most was the scientific accuracy of several passages. As an engineer, I was amazed by descriptions of embryology, astronomy, and geology that were only discovered by modern science centuries later. That shouldn't be possible in a book written 1,400 years ago in the Arabian desert. On the second night of reading, I came across something that left me speechless. There is no compulsion in religion. What? For decades I had believed that Islam spread by force, through forced conversions. But there it was, clearly written, the opposite. I kept reading about respect for Jews and Christians as people of the book, about how God created different peoples and tribes so they might know one another, about how diversity was part of the divine plan. Where was the hatred I had expected to find? On the third day, when I read about the story of Jesus, yes, Jesus Christ is revered in the Qur'an as one of the greatest prophets, I had to stop and ask myself, where on earth did I get all those wrong ideas about Islam? With each page, my worldview crumbled a little more. This wasn't the book I had imagined. This was a book that spoke directly to the heart, that answered the existential questions that had haunted me for years, that offered a clear and rational path for life. For the first time in 75 years, something made complete sense to me. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop studying. I bought more books, watched documentaries, sought out serious academic sources on Islamic history. I wanted to be sure I wasn't being manipulated or deceived. What I discovered devastated me. For decades, I had built my opinion about Islam based on sensationalist headlines, political commentary, and superficial analysis. I had never bothered to study the original sources, the real history, the authentic teachings. I began to understand that what I saw on the news about terrorism and extremism did not represent true Islam, just as the Crusades or the Inquisition do not represent true Christianity. I had committed the most basic mistake an engineer could make, drawing conclusions without analyzing the correct data. The nights became different. Instead of lying awake, tormented by existential emptiness, I would read, reflect, take notes. For the first time since my wife's death, I had a purpose, a quest that filled my days, but the internal struggle was intense. My intellectual pride resisted. How could I, Heinrich Müller, a trained engineer, an educated and experienced man, have been so wrong for so long? How could I admit that I had been prejudiced and ignorant? There were nights when I would close the books and try to return to my old way of thinking. It was more comfortable, more familiar, but the truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. It's like trying not to see the sun after the curtains have already been opened. Slowly, very slowly, I began to accept that maybe, just maybe, I had found something I had been searching for unknowingly for decades. It was on a Thursday night, 3 months after my encounter with Ahmad. I was reading, for the third time, the chapter Al-Fatiha, the opening of the Qur'an, when something extraordinary happened. It wasn't a mystical vision or a supernatural experience. It was something much deeper, an absolute, rational certainty. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful, praise be to Allah, Lord of the worlds, the most compassionate, the most merciful, Master of the day of judgment. You alone we worship, and you alone we ask for help. Guide us on the straight path. I had read these words hundreds of times before, but that night they pierced my heart like a blade of light. I understood that I was no longer reading about God. I was speaking to God. For the first time in decades, I felt that someone was listening on the other side. I closed the book, stood up from my chair, and, without even thinking, knelt right there in the living room. At 75 years old, with knees aching from decades of hard work, I prostrated on the cold floor of my home in Munich and cried like I hadn't cried since I was a child. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of recognition, of coming home. It felt like my soul had been lost in a desert for 50 years and had finally found water. At that moment, I knew with the same certainty I have about the laws of physics. Allah was real, Muhammad was his messenger, and the Qur'an was his word. It was no longer a matter of opinion or intellectual debate. It was fact. My pride, my prejudices, my fears, all of it became secondary in the face of this overwhelming truth. I could no longer pretend I didn't know what I had discovered. I called the Islamic Center of Munich and scheduled a meeting with Imam Abdullah. My voice trembled as I said, I would like to convert to Islam. On the other end of the line, there was a surprised silence, then a warm voice. Welcome, brother. When can you come? The following Saturday, I walked to the mosque on Wallnerstrasse. My legs trembled, not from fear but from emotion. In 7.5 decades of life, after so many certainties, I was about to begin again like a child. Imam Abdullah, a kind man from Morocco, spoke with me for 2 hours. He wanted to make sure I understood what I was doing. When I recited the Shahada, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, it was as if a light turned on inside my chest. The transformation was immediate and profound, and I'm not just talking about religious practice, praying 5 times a day, reading the Qur'an, fasting during Ramadan. I'm talking about a change in the soul. The existential emptiness that had tormented me simply vanished. I had purpose, direction, inner peace. My children were shocked. Some friends drifted away, neighbors whispered. But for the first time in decades, I didn't care about other people's opinions. I had found something more valuable than social approval. I had found the truth. Today, 6 months later, I wake up every day with gratitude. I pray, I read, I study, I help at the mosque. I'm part of a community that welcomed me like family. Ahmad, the man who helped me in the park, has become my brother in faith and my best friend. In old age, when most people are preparing to leave this world, I finally learned how to live. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. I know it may be hard to believe. A 75-year-old German, a former Islamophobe, converting to Islam after reading a book. But the truth doesn't ask for permission to be inconvenient or surprising. My message is simple. It's never too late to question your certainties, to admit you might be wrong, to open yourself to what the world truly has to offer. I wasted decades hating people I didn't even know, judging a religion I had never truly studied. I'm not trying to convert anyone. Every person has their own path, but if my story planted a seed of curiosity in your mind, if it made you question your own prejudices about anything at all, then it was worth sharing. True knowledge doesn't come from newspaper headlines or internet comments. It comes from sincere searching, from studying original sources, from real human contact with people different from yourself. If this story touched your heart in any way, subscribe to the channel to hear more real-life stories of transformation and resilience. Click the bell so you don't miss the next episodes. And in the next video, I'll share something even more powerful. How my children reacted when they found out their father had become a Muslim, and the difficult conversations we had to face as a family. A story of love, rejection, forgiveness, and reconciliation that will move you. Until next time, and may Allah bless all of you. Muslims, Christians, Jews, agnostics. We are all children of the same Creator,